Another video exploration of the story. My name is Scott Dalen, an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa, and I'm presenting these videos weekly as a companion to a Bible study that we are doing here in my congregation based on something called the story. Kind of looks like that. The story is a condensed biblical narrative put together a few years back by a guy named Randy Frazee. And the aim of this is to present the overarching narrative that's found within the Bible in more of a story novel type form. So it's just a little more accessible, a little bit easier to read. It takes portions of the scripture and lays them out verbatim, and then there's also some of the gaps are kind of filled in with more of summaries. So that's kind of the point of the story, and we have been going through it for a few months now. And as I mentioned, I do these videos just to kind of go along with them for anyone who was unable to join us for the previous evening's discussion. This particular week was a little bit on the kooky side because of a technological error on my part, and I will fully own this. We kind of had a mix-up, and some people read chapter 17, and some people read chapter 16. We were supposed to be on chapter 16, but again, my bad, my fault. It was me. Those of you who were there will attest to this, that it was all on me. But what these two chapters are aimed at is first the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel in chapter 16, and then kind of also moving into the things coming south towards Judah. And then in chapter 17, we actually see the fall of Judah as well, to two different empires. Now, what we ended up doing was kind of discussing both of these together. It was admittedly very disjointed because people had read different things, and I had actually ended up reading both out of order, which was strange, but had done the prep work for chapter 16. So it was just kind of an odd situation, but what we as a group decided to do was go ahead and just discuss them together, since the story is very similar between the two. And then we were going to continue to move forward then from that as we go forward into the next weeks. So basically the time period that we are in, it picks up about the year 700 BCE, actually just a little bit before that. I think it's actually like 733 or 723 or somewhere in that range, BC, so prior to Jesus. And of course, we've been going through with the history of the divided kingdoms and their tension with one another and all the different kings, and how the majority of the kings did a really poor job of following God and leading the people to rely on God. And then because of that, God raises up prophets who go and speak to the people and also confront the monarchs. So that's kind of where we've been, and that continues on through these two chapters. A lot of what we talked about last night had to do with the history of the different empires that were kind of coming up at that time, and the political realm, and kind of how all of this deals into it. Now, if we back up all the way to clear the heck back into Exodus and even Genesis, Egypt, down in the northeast part of Africa, where of course Egypt is still today along the Nile, they were always a power to be reckoned with. They were an empire that had great strength, that had great resources, and were always just kind of there. But they were one of the major powers kind of throughout this early history. And so they're kind of down, to the southwest of Israel, and where most of our action is going on, but they're always just kind of there. And we hear about Egypt off and on throughout the various narrative that, somebody would go to Egypt, they'd hide out there, they would go and spend time there, whatever. So we continue to hear little snippets of Egypt, but always just kind of in passing. But that's kind of been down there. So then as time goes on, there's all these different kingdoms that are up around the nation of Israel that are in that vicinity. And we begin to hear in the time of Solomon, who was, the third king, David's son, that his great wisdom, coupled with the military might that David, his father, had displayed, created a situation where Israel was greatly respected among the neighboring countries or the neighboring kingdoms, and because of that, those neighboring kingdoms paid tribute to Solomon. That's where a lot of Solomon's great riches came from, was because these different things paid tribute to him. And that's something known as being a vassal country or being a vassal nation or a vassal kingdom. That you're essentially, it's kind of like almost paying rent, but you're paying a tribute to this stronger kingdom, the stronger nation, not necessarily for protection, though sometimes that could be there, but just basically so like, hey, we're going to pay you, so just kind of leave us alone. It's pretty much like, you know, pay me to not beat you up. It's kind of a bullying situation almost, but that was a very common situation politically in what's going on. So now as we fast forward from that time of David and Solomon, which was, you know, approximately the year 1000 to about the year 900-ish, give or take, BCE. Now we fast forward a couple hundred years. And during that time, in the northeast of Israel, the Assyrian Empire has been growing, expanding, getting stronger, gaining notoriety, gaining power, gaining strength. And where we pick up here in chapter 16 is we see the Assyrians now coming in and threatening the northern kingdom of Israel. There is, let's see, who's the king there? I'm blanking on who the king is, but you know, once again, we're looking at the situation where there's so many different king names, it gets kind of confusing. But so they come in and at first, Israel is a vassal nation to Assyria. So it's like, we're paying you tribute, but at the same time, they make a pact with Egypt, thinking that Egypt will protect them against the Assyrians. And when the Assyrians find out about it, they're like, okay, you are traitors now, so we're going to take you over. So that's what prompts the invasion. And they invade, and they're pushing their way down south through the nation of Israel, eventually getting to the capital. They besiege the capital, and after just a couple of years, the nation of Israel falls to Assyria, to the Assyrian Empire. Now, within the scripture, this happens in the book of First Kings, and it's very, very brief, ironically, which is something that I had forgotten about, just how brief the conquest of Israel is. It's like half a chapter. That's kind of all it is. But they fall. A lot of the people of notoriety, like the royal family and the high-ranking officials, high-ranking military people, the artisans, they're all hauled off into exile around the Assyrian Empire. So they're spread out, basically split them up so they can't conspire with one another to continue to fight against us. That's the mentality. And the Assyrians bring in people from different areas, and this is the northern portion of the Promised Land. This is what has been called Samaria. The Kingdom of Samaria is another name for it. Also, at times, it's called the Kingdom of Ephraim because that was the largest tribe of that group. But these people come in, and those Israelites who are left, or the Jewish people who are left, they kind of intermingle, and their descendants are the Samaritans that we hear about later in Jesus' time. That they don't get along real well, and that's because they're considered half-breeds because the Jewish people intermingled with the various Assyrian people who came in to inhabit the area. Now, the people who are hauled off in the Assyrian exile never really come home. They're just kind of they're out there. As compared to the Babylonian exiles who are allowed to come home, and I'll get to that in a minute. The Assyrian exiles don't. They just the Jewish culture is spread throughout the Assyrian Empire. Now, this leads me to my next point that we kind of talked about last night: is the rise and fall of the various empires. So again, I mentioned Egypt earlier, down to the southwest in Africa, and they're always kind of there, and they are. But then at the same time, we have the rise of Israel, which was not an empire by any means, but it was definitely a strong kingdom in its heyday. But then once the split happened under Solomon's kid, they weakened. They continue to weaken for a couple hundred years. Then Assyria comes in, like I said, in that 730-ish BCE time period, and Israel falls. Now, Assyria continues down through the nation and basically comes to the border with Judah, the southern kingdom, and Judah defies them, um, and says, we're not gonna, no, we're not gonna give in to you. But they continue down, and they get all the way down to Jerusalem and besiege Jerusalem for like 3 years. And the king, or not the king, but the commander of the Assyrian army calls upon the people in the name of God, and is trying to appeal to them, like, don't listen to your king. Hezekiah was that king, and he was a good king. But they said, don't listen to him. He's trying to lead you astray. God has brought us in here to take over your nation because he is displeased with you. But lo and behold, the angel of the Lord comes through in the middle of the night and kills like 144,000, or a whole bunch, over 100,000 of their army. And so they all run away, and the king of Assyria is then assassinated by some of his generals who weren't too happy with him. And this kind of, we see, because of this, they let go of trying to take over Judah, but Judah then becomes a vassal nation of Assyria, just like Israel had before. So we kind of still see some of that political stuff going on in the background, but they're not conquered. We fast forward then about 100 years, maybe about 150 years. The exact time period escapes me, but in that time, the Assyrian Empire begins to lose ground as the Babylonian Empire, which is more directly east of Israel, as they begin to expand and grow and gain might and gain power. So eventually the Babylonians take over the Assyrians, and they're going through this whole area, and they come in and they end up taking over Judah, the southern kingdom. And this is what's going on now in chapter 17. Excuse me. But so as they come in, and they, once again, they besiege Jerusalem. They end up taking over Jerusalem and utterly destroy it. The city of Jerusalem is destroyed. The temple is destroyed. Once again, prominent people from within that kingdom are hauled off into exile, and they're in exile for a period of time before finally being able to come back. Now, during that time, and this is a little bit of jumping ahead to what we'll cover in the next couple of weeks, but during the Babylonian exile, that's where we have the book of Daniel, which a lot of people are familiar with, Daniel in the lion's den. We also have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who are the three men who are thrown into the fiery furnace by King Nebuchadnezzar, because they will not, they continue to bow down to God, and they won't bow down to this big statue. So that all goes on. The book of Esther is in there as well. That's also coming up in the upcoming chapters. So all that is going on during the Babylonian exile. But eventually, after the Babylonians, then comes the Persian Empire. And Persia, you may recognize as Alexander the Great. That's part of his whole deal. So they come in, they take over the Babylonians, and it's actually the Persians who allow the Israelites to go back to the Promised Land, rebuild Jerusalem, rebuild the temple again. So the second temple. That's all coming. But so this is kind of the thing that's going on there. Following the Persians, though, eventually we get to the Romans, and they're the empire that's in power during Jesus' time. So that's kind of that's a lot of what we talked about last night, was that whole big empire arc that throughout history. And we're getting into a portion of history within the scripture where things get really kind of difficult to track, and what we know is scattered between a lot of the different books like Chronicles and Kings, and the narratives that are present within some of the different prophets. Last night we talked about the prophet Isaiah and his work, and the prophecies that were made through Isaiah. We talked some about the scholarly notion of Isaiah, that they think it might have been written by 3 different people at 3 different times, and that it focuses on different portions of history. But we also talked a little bit, not quite as much, but about some of the later prophets around the time of Judah's fall, and that's like Ezekiel and Jeremiah, who were active during that time. So a little while later. But because of that, sometimes the history within the scripture gets really hard to keep track of. But we're getting into a portion now where more historical data is available as we grow ever closer towards Jesus' time. And those different empires, there's records that scholars of various bents have explored. So we kind of get some of that. That's a lot of what we talked about last night. Again, it was disjointed. It was not as structured as we normally are, just because of the way things came together. But that's kind of a lot of what we talked about. And I think the last thing that we talked about is once the people are hauled off into exile, we notice within the prophetic writings, the prophetic statements, the word of the Lord comes, and it goes away from judgment, like, because you have turned your backs on me, now I will turn my back on you and you will lose the promised land. And it turns more towards a message of hope, a message of reconciliation, a message of return, that one day you will come back, and that this is good for you, but it's not forever. And that notion of, and we talked about why that is, and we continue to see that within the world today, that there's still a lot of bad stuff that goes on, and yet the word of the Lord, the good news of God through Jesus, which shapes how we see this Old Testament stuff as well, shows us that there is more to come, that we hold on to the hope, the promises of God that are made to us through Jesus Christ, that yes, there is trouble now, but there is more to come. And that's kind of really sums up what we talked about last night. So if you have thoughts, questions, comments from either chapter, and you want to share those down in the comment section, by all means, please do. Next week, we'll go into chapter 18, which is about Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So that's where we're going next week. So other than that, I hope you have a great week, and God bless.